Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 edition of our series FinTech Fridays, brought to you by BDO Australia. My name is Tim Aman. I'm BDO's Global FinTech Leader, as well as our National Financial Services Leader. Before we kick things off, I'd like to quickly draw your attention to the housekeeping slide that is currently on your screen. To start, you are all automatically muted, but we'll be accepting questions throughout the session, and you can submit these through the tab on the question tab below. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible. However, if we cannot respond to your question, we will follow up with you after the webinar concludes. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please click the support button, which is one of the bottom tabs on your screen. And finally, this session is being recorded, and all registrants will receive a follow-up email containing the slides, a link to the recording, access to register for future sessions, and the speaker contact details. This is the third year running our FinTech Friday series. At BDO, we are proud to support the FinTech sector. We understand that for the FinTech ecosystem to thrive in Australia, it requires the efforts of government, educational institutions, industry bodies, and private business like BDO, who have knowledge and resources to support FinTechs at each stage of their journey. Whether it be increasing their visibility to the right networks, providing financial education, being the voice for regulatory change, or preparing their business to meet their next goal. Our purpose in carrying out this initiative is to assist all those operating within the FinTech space, a platform to ask questions and understand more deeply the sector in which they operate. Over the next year, we'll continue to deep dive into the FinTech subsectors. However, today we'll be focusing on RegTech, a very topical matter, which addresses challenges around regulation and compliance and the financial transparency into the regulations. I'm very happy to be joined by two excellent panelists, Deborah Young and Lisa Schultz. Deborah Young is the founding CEO of the RegTech Association, a global nonprofit industry member body focused on accelerating adoption of RegTech solutions and creating a global center of excellence. Deborah also sits on the Australian Federal Government FinTech Advisory Committee, New South Wales Government ICT Procurement Task Force, the National Blockchain Roadmap RegTech Committee, and is an observer in the ASIC Digital Committee, and a regular speaker, presenter, and designer of RegTech programs for the association and its partners with the regulators in Australia and overseas. I'm also joined by Lisa Schultz, founder of Verifier. Verifier is a consent-driven data sharing platform which puts people in control of their data. Lisa also sits on the Consumer Data Advisory Committee for Banking, the Consumer Data Right Advisory Committee for Energy, and is also an APRA Strategic Industry Reference Group for the Data Collection Solution. She is a founding director of the RegTech Association. Welcome, Deborah and Lisa.
Thank you very much.
To kick things off, let's take an overall look at the RegTech ecosystem. Who are the players? What issues are being solved? And what's the evolution of RegTech in Australia? And Deborah, I'll ask the first question with you in terms of, from your perspective, how do you define RegTech, and why is that different from the word FinTech?
A very good place to start, and one that I feel very passionately about. So RegTech is short for the words regulation technology, and it's really the application of technology to improve the way businesses manage their regulation and compliance. And I think when we look at that definition, I should say that this is not just for financial services, which may surprise some people. So this can be applied to any regulated industry vertical. So that might include energy, telco, healthcare, agriculture, and so on and so forth. So many of the solutions are sector agnostic. So I think that answers the second part of the question about why this is different from FinTech. And we also see that it's different from FinTech in that RegTech solutions are across the board enablers for any organization, anywhere, in any industry vertical. So I think that's what really differentiates it from FinTech. In fact, FinTech, it's arguable to say that FinTech actually needs RegTech. So that is how it is really different. And in terms of, we often hear the word disruption, and the only thing that RegTech disrupts is a bad process. And that's it, really simply put.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting. I mean, it's probably a nice way to put it, because I guess I think when you hear a lot in the press, they'll talk about fintechs, the disruptor, and I think if you look at RegTech, it's really trying to solve issues,
Yes.
and so I think that there's a slight branding issue, just I guess within the fintech RegTech space, but if I look at RegTech, I think as you outlined it, and we'll talk about it more, there's obviously been a lot of historical legacy issues with financial institutions, and to me, this is a problem-solving mechanism rather than something. It's not like two people sitting across in an incubator trying to completely disrupt, a system. So I think that's a good way to describe it. I guess in terms of, at a very high level, what issues is the association looking to try to solve? As I mentioned in both your intros, you guys are involved in lots of different boards and activities. So maybe just getting your perspective in terms of your focus areas and what you're trying to do as an association.
So when the association was established, around about 4 years ago now, and Lisa was part of that founding cohort, they really came together to address an issue of dysfunction in collaboration and communication. There was no simple way for all parts of the ecosystem to come together to have conversations in a safe and independent place. There was a lot of empty door knocking around town. So RegTech vendors would be door knocking around town with all of the banks. And of course, they were experiencing, they might get a meeting, but meeting with the wrong person with no appetite, no budget, and no alignment internally to be able to entertain that. So really, the community came together as one to really try and bring all parts of the ecosystem together to have the conversation. And I don't know whether Lisa might want to add something to that, because she was actually there the day that they decided to conceive this as an idea.
Yeah, to Deb's point, I think that's exactly right. It was, if you wind back that many years ago, this was very new stuff. And I think it comes back to it really was born out of the frustration of the RegTech vendors. We all are characterized, I would say, to Tim, to your point, older and deeply understood the problems. And I think to your point, Tim, about where RegTech sits in the landscape, if you think of fintech as a disruptor, and we agree RegTech's an enabler, I think the other characteristic of it was that all the problems that needed solving, all these broken processes, they were deep in the enterprise, and they were deep compliance processes. And that meant that the way I describe it is, if you think about this and financial services as a high-speed Ferrari, it's like we'd been driving around very fast without airbags. And if you think about compliance as the function, it was the last function to be automated, and that's what RegTech was. So you can imagine 4 years ago, a bunch of people who knew the problems, knew they needed solving, had gone out and pulled the tech together, and the frustration of knowing the problems there and not being able to really make progress. And the problem is, as much as people didn't have, in those functions, didn't necessarily have a task or a KPI around innovation, there were no innovation labs around RegTech. And yeah, so that's how I describe it. The airbag was missing.
Yeah, I think it's it's interesting, because I know we'll touch on this a little bit further on when we talk about remediation and innovation. But I think as the classic accountant / auditor, I would normally come across probably some of those frustrated people when we deal with banks, and if you meet the chief risk officer and you're meeting the compliance person, they're drowning in paperwork in terms of how they're staying up to date, or how they're trying to remediate sort of breaches. And and I think that's obviously some of the tension that's been coming out of the Royal Commission. And so so in some ways it's a little bit of a perfect storm. People driving around without the airbag, Royal Commission coming in, Australia being a hub for innovation, and some of these worlds are sort of colliding. Just sort of stopping there, I guess, in terms of maybe you guys can explain how the group collaborates, because I understand you have 150 collaborators, and you sort of mentioned it can be sector agnostic. So I guess, how do you manage the different voices? And then I guess maybe just for the people that are listening, if you guys can give an example of something that's going to be broader in a broader vertical to bring that to life for the people listening.
Sure. So we do what we do via programs, and I'm happy to report this week we're actually 170 organisations in the community. It's growing daily. We're getting new members every day at the moment, which is very exciting. And a new stat from yesterday is that we actually think we have now about 20% of the world's RegTechs are now part of our association. So this is it's been an awesome effort by a lot of people to get us to this place. But how we do it is actually via program. So rather than being a one-on-one introduction portal, which really just takes us back to the bad old days of where you're speaking to the wrong people all the time, we actually do it in a safe place. And in order to do that, we do it via program. And so what we will typically do is either a financial services vendor will, a financial services provider will come to us with a problem statement. We can then curate the RegTech around that specific problem statement via a program that we run internally, or alternatively, we do it via public programs. And so as an example, we have a program called RegTech Edge. That is a problem statement, general problem statement driven program across any vertical, and we invite our RegTech Association members to come and present to the customer base on a public basis. So anybody can come to those. Then we obviously run a range of other programs, including education, which is critically important for the points that you've just been making around, we're suffering from a little bit of an identity crisis. So we certainly want to talk more about RegTech and why it is different from FinTech. But then finally, I guess the jewel in our crown is our annual conference, which is in a couple of weeks' time. And the idea of that conference is not just a meeting of everybody, but it's actually to spark off new discussions and to start the discovery on new verticals. And so we'll be pressing some of those buttons in the content during that. And in fact, Lisa is involved in one of those that we're calling New Economy. And the whole idea of the New Economy is looking at what are the other opportunities for RegTech to play beyond financial services across a range of different industries, and some of those will be driven by CDR, obviously, probably in energy and telco. So we're just starting to, dip our toe in the water of verticals outside of financial services, and that will become evidence through the programs that we are running.
Okay, and I think sorry, go ahead, Lisa. Yep.
I was just going to pick up. I think to Deborah's point, another piece of the success has been, I guess, right from the start, we saw that this was a market failure of information. To Deborah's point, and that what we needed to do was get a clearance between the suppliers of these tools and the customers, the corporates. And I think early on, one of the other things that the association's done a lot of is really co-create programs with the regulators involved. Because I think if you understand the dynamic of RegTech, it's very, very specific in the sense that, in a way, the arbiter of taste, if you like, ultimately is the regulator or the supervisor. So, we can build whatever RegTech tools we want, but no one's going to consume them unless they can't be endorsed. But how can that process be smooth? So I think that's, Deborah, I think one of the absolute wins that you've had as a CEO is really bringing the regulators along on the journey.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I guess that's going to be one of my next questions, I guess, Deborah, in terms of, you've been CEO now for 2 years. What's been the highlight, for you to date? And I guess, in terms of, how would you define success for the association in the next sort of 2 or 3 years?
It's a great question. Look, I think the highlight probably came a couple of weeks ago when it became obvious to me that what we had managed to achieve over a reasonably short window is not only a large cohort of members, but I was able to put the Australian government the Australian government and the Commonwealth Bank of Australia and the New South Wales government brand on our conference. And this really is a very different place to where we were, 4 years ago, when we put our first conference together with a bit of string and sticky tape and hoped that people were going to, come and attend. So and why that was such a critical moment is all of a sudden, this was no longer a small cohort of vendors. This is actually now government, regulated entities, regulators, RegTechs all coming together, shoulder to shoulder, to say this is important and we need to drive growth. And we can see that this can really solve some significant challenges, not only in Australia, but we're part of a global village, so the rest of the world. And so I think that was the highlight for me the day that I popped that Australian government logo on. I had a moment that I just said, wow, this is actually quite incredible. And to some of the points that we've just been talking about, I think the future is we are narrowing that gap in accelerating adoption. And so we've remained, since the very first day that I ever met Lisa in a boardroom in Sydney, the RegTech Association founders were super clear on accelerating adoption and creating a global centre of excellence. Super clear. And so we've stuck to that over the last 4 years. It has not let us down. And I can now start to see that that is actually happening. And so the programs that I've just been talking about, as an example, if you think about the relationship between a vendor and a bank, for example, was fraught with difficulty, as we've just outlined. And now through running our programs, what we've done is we've made it easier for the regulated entity to get to the best RegTech solutions in the world. We've made it easier on the RegTech vendors, even if they don't get chosen to go through, they know that the bank has looked at their solution and has provided them feedback quickly, and they know where they stand, which is light years ahead of where they were 4 years ago, because nobody would ever get back to them. So we have been able to accelerate just that first point of engagement. Now it remains to be seen, and it will be part of our work plan going forward on how we can address things like procurement and IT security and other barriers that there are. Once you get there, then there's other challenges. So they'll be the things that we'll continue, to work on. And just on the point about creating the global centre of excellence, which is also clearly, a big focus for us, is that we've started just signing a series of MOUs with like associations around the world so that we can strongly link arms. So we've signed one with Canada. We've signed one with the Nordic regions where they have RegTech associations, and we'll be linking arms with those organisations and others to try and get this connectivity and foster a global RegTech language, so that we can get some, some consistent terms and the way that we refer to things as part of a global language. So that'll be our focus going forward, alongside getting some more investment into the community.
Well, I think it's fantastic, the work that you guys have been able to do over the past few years. And I think, that, as you mentioned, that sort of pinnacle moment is when the government gets involved and you're starting to get that engagement with the bigger banks. Because obviously, historically, with RegTech or fintechs, there's getting that right level of engagement with the bigger banks to look at the solution. And so and typically there's always barriers, and so in terms of getting to that particular point. And I think you'd probably rather be dealing with procurement rather than, because at least you're inside the entry gate there, and you're starting to have the right conversation. So well done to you guys on that. I think from a global perspective, I think what's quite fascinating, and obviously given the fact that RegTech is such an a key focus area for Australia, and what you guys have done globally is fantastic. In relation to the US market, is there anything that you're doing or collaborating with in the US currently?
Yeah, so we've started reaching out to some of the US regulators as well. We have a good relationship with an organisation called the Alliance for Innovative Regulation, that is that organisation is a non-profit as we are, and it was founded by an ex-regulator and an advocate, and so we're working closely with her. She will be actually speaking on our program in a couple of weeks' time. She's very knowledgeable. She knows all of the regulators in the world, and so we want to try and tap into that as much as possible to help open the doors with the US regulators a little bit more over time. But I guess we're just in the early stages right now. On the UK side of things, we actually have a good relationship with the FCA, and I have a regular bi-monthly meeting with them where we just at information sharing mode at the moment, but that's a very positive. That is a very positive development for us for sure. So it's just about keeping these conversations going and sharing information as much as we can, and so I guess that's where our focus is right now, is just keeping those relationships going through information sharing.
Yeah, and I think that's great that you're progressing that, because obviously a lot of times when I talk to my global network of fintechs, the US is almost, although Australia is an island, the US sometimes operates a little bit like an island. So trying to break into the US market to get that sort of credibility and connection is a great next step, because if we fast forward to the opportunities to export RegTech cross border, those are important steps that you guys are doing. So that's great to hear. Lisa, sort of shifting gears a little bit, you've been a founder of a successful RegTech, and maybe if you can just sort of explain to the listeners what your startup journey has been like, and some of the challenges that you faced to get to where you are today.
Yeah, it's sort of, I guess, Verifier started off, we are, as you said, a consent-driven data sharing platform, and our mission is to give people access to their data to get better outcomes. And so when we got started, funnily enough, people said, "Are you a fintech?" And we're like, "Oh, yeah, guess so." And then as time went on, there was the RegTech stream at the Singapore Fintech Festival, and we thought probably we're more a RegTech. But the truth is we're a data company, and we're very much operating in the space of what, again, remains pioneering, but the idea that people have a right to their data, and that by enabling them to access it, you can actually get a win in terms of data being shared, and data being shared in a privacy by design way. So that, I suppose, with 2020 hindsight, mental note to self, don't do totally pioneering things that are completely globally leading, because it does add a load to the process. So I'm very proud of the Verifier team, and very grateful to our amazing global multinational customers, our early stage investors, my team. And I guess you can hear in that I would describe the journey as somewhat more tortuous than not, but very rewarding at the same time. I think certainly from Verifier's point of view, when we got going, our starting product was proof of income. So we are, to this day, the only frictionless sub 2-second proof of income service in the market here in Australia. And of course, what I, looking back, didn't realise at the time was that we were releasing a product into what was going to become one of the big sort of hot topics of financial services regulation, being responsible lending. And frankly, that has been a really interesting learning curve. But nonetheless, the exciting thing is right this second, very heartening for a founder. Actually, yesterday I did a credit limit increase with Verifier, and it was done in like sub 2 seconds. And I was so excited, I took a screenshot and showed my whole team. So I think ultimately when RegTech's doing its job, it really is a win between community and commerce, because I hate admin. Possibly Verifier was started because I hate admin. And I also am obsessed about privacy, but I want the data shared. I just want it done the right way. So that, I guess, we've hit all the obstacles and challenges that we've been talking about. But I think at the same time, what has really helped is the ability to elevate the conversation and to talk about it in a broader community. And, personally, I've found I found it an incredibly rewarding journey to be there at the thought bubble idea of the RegTech Association, see it turn into this great community. And I guess for me, the table stakes, when it all gets too difficult, for me, I go to, I guess, my happy place, which is we're building trust at scale. I mean, we couldn't be in a more important sector, if you ask me. And that is, I think we've all experienced the dismantling of different levels of trust in different contexts. And this is about building trust at scale, or as my team likes to talk about it, frictionless and fair. And it's just table stakes. So it's a really exciting place to operate. And I'm delighted that, we're growing and we're scaling, and that's all good.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously, if you wind back the clock, you were obviously you saw an issue in the marketplace. Obviously, it's come to light with some of the new regulation on responsible lending, and obviously, that transparency and trust. And I think that's, it hits the nail on the head in terms of consumer confidence, and trusting the system. And obviously your company touches on a few different points, so, I know we've talked about CDR, and, we're going to talk about it again in a few months' time, but, you were kind of on the forefront of that and the sharing of data. So, so I think you're in a great spot in terms of being able to talk from a perspective of knowledge on the subjects, which is fantastic. And I guess, my last question before we move into the regulators a little bit is if you can just explain your kind of role on the Consumer Data Right Advisory Committee.
So some may laughingly say that I ended up on the Open Banking Advisory Committee by weight of words. So if you wind back to 2016, that's, by the way, the advisory committee is a personal appointment. It's not Verifier, it's me as me. But I guess when you wind back and you think about what Verifier wanted to do, we initially, funnily enough, I trotted up to the ARCA credit conference, and having done a lot of work in credit risk before, I actually asked the banks to share open banking style APIs with us so that we could solve responsible lending. Now, they all went, oh, ha, 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 understandably. So when the Productivity Commission inquiry was on, I felt, since I could see what the potential was of that, I thought, oh, well, I'll put in a submission, never having done anything like that before. And surprisingly, I ended up being asked to present in person. Again, never done that before. And so effectively, I've been involved since those early days talking to the Productivity Commission about what was possible. After they put their interim recommendations out, I went, oh my God, they're listening. So I thought, oh, well, I better put another submission and give them a sense of how I think they should solve it. And then Scott Farrell did his report, and naturally I had, gave him input, and then it rolled on. And so I applied and was accepted to be on that open banking committee, and then again applied and was accepted to be on the open energy. So yeah, I really have it's been a privilege to be involved right from the initial ideas way back when.
Okay, great, thank you for that. Why don't we move on to investment in regulators? I guess that's because I guess there's been a bit written, Deborah, by yourself, in terms of in your opinion editorial, in terms of the state of Australian fintech. But I guess it's obviously fantastic that Australia is third from a global perspective, from a RegTech hub. I guess in your words, how do you think that Australia got to be the third biggest innovation hub in the world? Because obviously we're a small market down here.
Look, I think it's a combination of factors. One is, I think Australians have always had a reasonably strong culture of compliance. And I think we're also adaptable people. I mean, if we just think about the pandemic, we had very little drama really in the big scheme of things, in that we're quite a compliant nation, and we did what we were being asked to do by and large. But I think also we gathered quite a lot of confidence post the GFC. In how well Australia actually emerged post the GFC in relation to our infrastructure and our compliance and our regulation, and I think that gave a lot of people confidence And so I think that this is why we have begun to develop this very strong compliance stack, if you like, in Australia. And this is why we are now number 3 in the world. And remarkably, really, if you think about, we sit third behind the US and the UK, who are both major financial centres. So we are punching well and truly above our weight. But the same cannot be said for the investment flowing into the sector. And so that's where we are lagging. We are definitely lagging behind in those stakes.
And so I guess, yeah, from an investment perspective, I guess what's the association do to obviously raise that? Obviously, it's a bit of a known fact that the investment has gone down. I think some of the latest stats were 50% over the past couple of years. Yep. And I guess in terms of your discussions with the government and regulators, how will that change, I guess, going forward? Because it's such, from my perspective, obviously, with my accent, it gives me away I'm an American, but I've been down here for 20 years and I've seen sort of the innovation. I've also seen the compliance angle, in terms of the Australian population, follows the rules much better than an American, as a general sense. And, and I think it's how do we not lose this opportunity because of the fact that, RegTech, is an innovation hub and a global leader. So I guess, what's the work that you guys are doing to make sure that we don't fall behind once other countries start pumping more into the investment?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the important roles that the association has is to do research, because we need that research to advocate effectively. And we did some research back in the end of 2019, so it's a little bit more than a year old now, but we found that 70% of our RegTech founders were self-funded. So that actually means that people were putting up their houses and money from family and friends, and small pots of angel investment were coming in. So just being able to quantify that number kind of helped shape and form what we knew needed to come next, because if we were number 3 in the world, but 70% of it was self-funded, this is obviously not a scalable or a sustainable model going forward. So we have education is absolutely key here. Education is key, because we need to speak to investors and indeed the government, who can be investors really in a way because they are key influencers in the whole ecosystem. So we run our programs, and I spend my time on forums such as this, where we can provide that element of education about the opportunity for RegTech. So that's absolutely key. And back to my earlier comment about a RegTech taxonomy, this is also key, because unless investors can understand what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about RegTech, we need a language. The other challenge around investment into the sector has come because RegTech is not an app that you can download on your phone and that it works tomorrow. Lisa made the points earlier. These are very deep processes within organizations. So the sales cycle is longer than it would be for something you can just download and it works. So the sales cycle is a bit longer, and clearly we need to align with investors around this idea that the sales cycle is a bit longer. Of course, what we'd like to see is that sales cycle come right down, and that's part of the reason why we're all about accelerating adoption so that we can bring down that sales cycle. But that has been a little bit of a barrier. But what we are spending our time doing now is educating. And one of the points of lobbying that we've been doing with the government through the Senate Committee on FinTech and RegTech is this whole idea of a patient capital fund. So an investment fund could be created. We have said that could be funded through a small percentage of the breach fines. And last year, financial institutions, $10.4 billion. And if we just look at the Australian part of that, just 1 to 2% of that could be created into a patient capital fund that would understand the fundamentals of RegTech, and it would be a source of capital for these fast growing companies that are currently 70%, funded by themselves. So there's things on the table at the moment that we are speaking to government about right now, but I would say really education is absolutely paramount.
Okay. And I guess, sort of on that topic, I think, Lisa, you've talked, before about, RegTech, and there's a bit of a challenge between remediation, with the big banks and innovation. But from your perspective, are you starting to see a bit of a change from the bigger banks to say, okay, we're working through this Royal Commission and we're trying to remediate, are we going to be able to set some money aside to look at a RegTech solution?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think we are seeing change, although, I mean, just to give you the visceral experience of it, like at the time of the Royal Commission, you can imagine there were a lot of RegTechs looking at the transcripts and listening and going, oh, X could fix that, Y, tech could fix that kind of thing. But obviously the most important thing in a Royal Commission is to deal with the community harm that's being exposed, and putting that context in there. I think one of the hardest things as a RegTech company going around talking to people at that time was, we're too busy remediating to do anything right now. That is extremely disheartening. And going back to the analogy, I'm not going to try and do the Ferrari airbag analogy, but we're so busy mopping up the harms of the past, we're not going to put the time in to prevent the currently happening harms. And it was a very, that's a difficult thing you can understand totally why that's happening, but the balance is needed. Now, I think things have moved on, and I think COVID, interestingly, has put more pressure on the need for digital first processes. So that's sort of re-accelerated. But I guess fundamentally it comes back to it's not just about remediation budgets. It also comes back to, and what we suggested in the Verifier submission to the Senate Select Committee was, maybe it's also a little bit about how regulators drive a balance there. So for instance, do you want the entire resources of whichever bank in question or provider focused on remediation, or would you allow them to reserve 10% of that budget to work on innovation at the same time and not penalise them for that? So that's the interesting balance. It's a very difficult one. There's a lot of emotion around it, but frankly, that is the thorny thing, is if you keep on, while you're remediating, you're redoing the same problems most likely. So what are you going to do? At some point, you have to bite the bullet and change the process. And the trouble is, if you're penalised for doing that, then that doesn't give anyone a win.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, because I guess, my sense when I'm talking to the bigger banks or broker dealers that are, being investigated by ASIC is there's obviously the cost for remediating historical sins, but it's the inability to look to the future to say, how do we solve for the problem in the future? And then overlaying that is the people cost, so anyone who's been through an ASIC investigation, they're completely burnt out, and so, and it sort of scars them, for a while. And so I think there's extra cost that the organization, without solving for the real problem or the root cause, because that, I think, leaves the institution in not a better place, because I think they're gonna end up losing good people. And as we know, the complexity of old systems, unless you do a bit of a refresh, it's not going to solve for the longer term. You can't solve for every particular issue. So so hopefully, I think in terms of, are you guys starting to see, maybe leave the bigger banks out of it, because they've obviously been in the news a lot and in the front and center with the Royal Commission. Is there another sector in the community that seems a bit more of an avid buyer of RegTech solutions because they're a bit more nimble than say the bigger banks?
you used the word nimble there, because I was just about to say, look, there've been great leaps forward in government, because government can be a significant buyer of RegTech. And so actually, not because we planned it, but simply because the pandemic has driven a real focus around RegTech, and government, both at a federal and certainly at a New South Wales state level, have actually seen the benefits that RegTech can bring. And just picking up on a point that you made in the previous conversation, Tim, this is actually about people. This is actually about enabling people to do a better job and actually giving them tools and resources and greater transparency to actually make better business decisions. And so to the point of that all these people are getting burned out, isn't it time that we supported them with some great tools to actually just do a better job, you know, have better accountability to your shareholders, and right down to the customer, and going back to the point of trust, you know, so that we as consumers can all walk around trusting the environment, you know, that we are in, I think is critically, important. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the trust component, you know, that word gets thrown around quite a bit, you know, and I think it's just a matter of, you know, how organizations, because I always put it on, you know, their slogans. You know, it's I think the banks, the RegTechs, you know, organizations such as ourselves that can sort of instill trust into the marketplace, and the people are going to be, if I fast forward 5 years, are going to be in a much better place. I think everyone's kind of chasing that holy grail of trust. You know, and I just, you know, I'm hopeful that people will start looking at RegTech as, to your point, Deborah, you know, is an enabler of the people, because you know, I think, you know, the people that are what I call in the back office a lot of times, you know, they're not on the front line of the banks, and you know, I think that group is actually sort of steering the ship, you know, or at least they're down on the second level, you know, putting the coal in the shed. So I think it's, you know, to me, it's an important group of people that needs to be happy and sustainable from a perspective on a go-forward basis. So
yeah.
I think there's going to be multiple phases of this. You know, I think we're really looking at Royal Commission. You guys mentioned the pandemic, you know, and I guess, you know, with COVID, and there seemed to be a push a lot more for remote, a lot more digital. Do you think that that's going to continue, or do you think when borders start opening up longer than 5 days at a time, do you think people are going to start going back to, you know, 2019 scenario?
I don't know what Deborah thinks about this. I don't think we're going back. I think we were hovering on a digital transformation, and it's just been accelerated. But I give you an example. We pivoted in the middle of the pandemic and delivered for some of our clients a hardship SaaS platform that sort of automated assessment. And to your point, it made life an awful lot easier for the back office teams that were just struggling under this mountain of process that they had never had that sort of volume before, and they were burning out. So that's a group that, you know, certainly, are they going to go back to how they were doing it before? Absolutely not. They've got it. They have nicknamed the platform and the portal. I think once you've nicknamed, it's like naming a dog, right? It's not going anywhere. So I can't imagine that the transformation and the investment people have made will wind back. But I agree, everyone talks about the new normal. I have no idea what the new normal looks like, but it won't be what we were doing. I'm sure of that.
No, and I think I agree wholeheartedly with Lisa. You know, I think this has changed the environment for a generation. I think we'll be operating in a more remote way going forward. I think, you know, interestingly, you know, I think during the budget cycles for organisations, I'd be pretty certain that people have slashed their travel budget for a start. You know, one of the benefits of this pandemic, if we can say that there are any benefits, is that it's brought us together in platforms like this, where we can have a very authentic conversation because all of a sudden we've broken down some barriers of this being very formal in a boardroom or, you know, some venue somewhere where everything is very formal. You know, we're speaking to you today from our homes. And so, you know, we've broken down a lot of barriers, so we're having more authentic conversations. So I think, you know, there's some great things that have come out of it, but I do think that the way that we interact and collaborate has kind of changed, and I think at least for our generation, it will be a while before, you know, things actually go back to a completely face-to-face model. So I think that we'll be with a hybrid model for some time, and lots of large organisations have in fact not really gone back to work properly yet in Australia. So yeah, let's wait and see. But I think there've been some great things out of it, and certainly great things have happened because of RegTech. Some great things, I'm sorry, have happened for RegTech out of this.
Yeah, and I think, and I'd probably agree, it's going to be a bit of a combination of forums. And I think, you know, if I look at, you know, there's a few other things, I guess, if we talk about the Royal Commission, and I guess one thing with COVID is almost some of the focus on the Royal Commission stopped. You know, people were dealing with the pandemic, people were working from home. You know, what's your sense, I guess, in terms of that pause that happened, you know, during 2020? Do you think the Royal Commission is going to become back to the forefront in 2021? And I guess that could be another impetus for driving forward RegTech.
I mean, obviously, from the Royal Commission, all of the legislative changes are still pending and in various stages of passing and so forth. So I suspect the agenda will resume in that sense. I guess my RegTech hope is that the emphasis focuses on innovation and what's possible, as opposed to remediation. And I guess for that, it's going to need, and again, this comes back to the work of the ecosystem. You know, I was just talking about this. We had a webinar yesterday on responsible lending, Back to the Future. And I guess the hope there was, we've had a pause. So instead of just thinking in a manual language, that we just take a moment, apply design thinking, work out consumer true north here, that ultimately my belief is that if we build processes that truly have the customer at the heart of things, then regulation will follow that. Community will be happy, and they'll be happy customers, and the corporates will be happy. And I think that's what I'd love to see. Now, whether that happens or not, but that's my RegTech prayer.
And I think, look, the pandemic has presented an opportunity for the innovation to catch up a little bit. So some of those changes that we might see yet to come to fruition through the Royal Commission, you know, this pause that you so nicely put it, and in fact, that's why we've called our conference From Full Stop to Future, because we were thrust, you know, within a matter of days into this future state that we couldn't have dreamed of that could happen. But I think it's actually given the innovation agenda time to kind of, you know, creep up while things were at a pause. So I think that, you know, it's almost as if it was a perfect storm, that something needed to happen, and that was the breakthrough that technology and certainly RegTech needed to kind of, you know, go up the curve, and so that certainly happened.
So I guess you guys talked a little bit about innovation in terms of, I guess if you can, Deborah, you mentioned the programs. Is that sort of how you'd have sandboxes of innovation, or is there something separate that you guys do that get groups of people together to innovate, like in a sandbox type environment?
Yeah, so we don't actually have a sandbox per se. We do everything that we do, and certainly virtually at the moment, we do kind of things, putting people and doing brief demos and things of that nature in front of the customer base. But one of the long-term goals of the association is to create a digital marketplace, and that could bring buyers and sellers together in an easy way that wouldn't need the association necessarily to be manually bringing people together, there would be a digital way that they could come together. And then what you could conceive could be included in that is a whole raft of things, but one of those could be a sandbox where through this digital platform, we might be able to access, synthetic data sets and things of that nature, and be able to test and pilot and things like that within that environment. So that remains kind of on. It's a bit of an aspiration of ours to be able to almost make some of the functions of the association into a digital format. So it's a goal at this stage.
Okay.
Sorry,
Lisa, go ahead.
Sorry. I was going to say, just picking up your point, I mean, if you're referring there to the idea of the design box piece that was in our submission and the associations put forward as well, I guess that there is that piece there that we've been very strong on, is the idea that, you really do have to start from design principles. Like, it really is a blank sheet of paper, what's possible in this process, as opposed to trying to automate what's already there. And that idea, I think we suggested it here, but I think Singapore might have picked it up first, MAS, but that idea of, and we've done a few of them on a very, with some of the regulators where we've had whiteboarding sessions and so forth with all the different participants in the ecosystem. And I think there's something there around jointly imagining what's possible and then thinking about it like that. And certainly I'm a big fan for that design thinking first. And I worry sometimes with the sandboxes that having the data without the collective imagination, I can build anything tomorrow, but is it the right thing?
Yeah, I work with someone like that. Yeah, so I think you have to balance, I think that the design and looking at the end solution is a good starting point, probably constructive. You can have a lot more constructive dialogue, kind of up front. I'm mindful of time, so I just have probably two more questions for the both of you. I guess in terms of the Senate committee is going to be releasing their final report in April. I guess from your perspective, what are the two of you hoping comes out of that final paper?
I'm really hoping that there will be a focus on investment to actually back these ever-growing cohort of high growth companies to actually do what they've, it's to achieve their potential and what they set out to do to really solve the greatest regulation and compliance challenges. So we can't just grow this big ecosystem, it needs to have some kind of backing. So I have only one ask, and that is that that they do what they can to encourage investment into the sector. And it might come from pure capital and maybe the patient capital fund that I've talked about. It could be government as a serious buyer of RegTech and government understanding what's actually sitting in their own backyard right now. It could be government influencing other sectors to actually get on board with the RegTech thing. So we've talked about, energy and telco and even superannuation. There's a whole bunch of sectors out there that could really use RegTech right now, and what can the government do to influence those? So really, investment can come from all of those different ways. And then also attracting some offshore companies to Australia to headquarter here. We've got a maturing RegTech sector here. So it's not, you're not starting from scratch conversation. So we've got a lot to offer. So it's all that kind of stuff rolled up into one. So that is I hope that we will get some more investment into the sector.
Okay, Lisa, from your perspective?
Look, I'd very much echo that. And I think pulling right back, just a recognition of the export. I mean, you started with on this point, Tim, in terms of the export potential. I think if you think of corridors that make sense as export hubs, because of Australia's really fantastic reputation around compliance, for whatever you think about that in our national character, we're kind of good at it. So it makes perfect sense to me that Australia should be a serious export hub for RegTech. And not only that, naturally, the Australian community would benefit. So I'd love to see more investment. And I do think for me, really, the third point that Deb made to me is the one I really hope that we hear from the Senate Select Committee, which is truly understanding that the government as the legislator is the arbiter of taste, and it's agencies that supervise and enforce. And ultimately, until laws are written and supervision occurs with a digital first, or at least an if not digital why not model, it's really hard, because at the moment, the mindset, I think, of most regulation is writing down how you should do a manual process. So role as market orchestrator and how that's going to flow through, I think, is probably the most powerful lever, even though it is the hardest, and for government, probably the most challenging. But I just hope they don't walk away from that bit.
Okay. And the final question, this is, you fast forward yourself a decade. What do you think the compliance landscape is going to look like here? And I guess globally, it's probably going to echo some of the points you just raised. But I guess what's your compliance nirvana in the year 2030?
For me, compliance nirvana is the key compliance control points are like little API probes with dashboards. And it's almost gone away as an issue because it's just part of the ether. And the conversation's moved to where I want it to go, which is, what does human-centric digital first look like? So I think we get lost in the ticking boxes bit, and we forget there are real humans making real choices. And so far as I'm aware, I don't think any human, and I think all of the economics on choice, which suggests ever makes a totally rational decision about money matters. So I want to see empathy come back in.
Okay. Deborah,
yeah,
final
and
word
I think
from you?
from my perspective, that we stopped talking about digital transformation. It's not a tomorrow plan, and that kind of gives it a sense of that it's something that I need to do tomorrow, or it doesn't impact me sitting at my desk today. I would like to see that go away, and that we are actually truly digital. And just back to the points of trust, is that we can be really confident as consumers in operating in environments where that trust is built in, and we feel absolute confidence, and we feel protected, and we feel that we're working within a safe environment. So that's what I would really like to see. And obviously I would like to see the first few Australian RegTech unicorns. How about that?
There we go. Something positive
Great
to conclude
goals.
the discussion. Yeah. So that brings us to the end of the discussion. Thank you, Deborah and Lisa, for your valued insights. I'm sure everyone who's listening would find that was a great session, and I appreciate your time. And hopefully next time we'll have a chance to meet in person, although I know we want to be digital. So that brings us to the end of our FinTech Friday session. You will see on our screen the details of our next webinars. We have a great lineup coming up through the entire year. We have a schedule on our website that goes all the way through December. Next month, we're joined by Rebecca Shaw-Guppy, who was on last year, our CEO for FinTech Australia, and Mark Orchard, who is a director of startups in our Brisbane office. The details of the webinar will be shared with you in a follow-up email from today's session. And finally, before we close the session, we'd appreciate if you could fill out a short feedback survey, which will launch once we close the webinar. Thank you for joining us today. Have a great Friday. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Tim.